So today's episode of the podcast is going to be a little bit different. Normally on this show, I have something planned, something written out, something specific that I'm going to share with the folks who are listening. But this is going to be different. As someone who talks about all sorts of issues, all sorts of topics for Christian men, I get asked a lot of random seeming questions. So what I'm going to do on this show today is I'm going to answer a handful of those different questions. So this will be a wide range of topics of me sharing my thoughts on different issues, different questions, different things that get asked to me as they all relate to Christian men. So it's going to be a little bit more free flowing, but it should be a whole lot of fun. So let's get started. So recently I was in a conversation that was taking place and some relatively common points were coming up. And this was a conversation about marriage and relationships and men and women. And where the conversation moved towards was the issue of husbands, of men, always trying to fix their wives, always trying to solve problems and solve the situation, fix the situation, get it done, come up with the solution and move on. And how this is such a common issue and how it causes problems between men and women, between husbands and wives. And that by itself could be the entire episode today. But what I want to share with you is just two thoughts as it relates to that. One thought for men and one thought for women. So for men, we hear all the time, well, you need to just listen more. That sometimes goes against our nature to fix. So guys, what I need you to hear is that listening is fixing. We don't often think of it that way. We think we have to actually go do something. But in this scenario, when we're talking about this, if your wife needs you to just listen and not fix, you need to realize in that scenario, from your mindset, you can think about it that way, that listening is fixing. And for the ladies, for the women who are checking this episode out or listening to this episode, you need to realize that his desire to fix is loving. So fixing is loving from his viewpoint. He is trying to do what he can to make the situation better. So guys, instead of getting frustrated that you're not able to fix things, realize that listening is fixing. And ladies, instead of getting frustrated that he's trying to fix things, realize and appreciate that fixing is loving. If we could have those two perspectives, that would help a lot with that particular issue. Next one here. So I have out a new book that I wrote a couple weeks ago called The Tactical Guide to the Bible. And because of that, I've been getting questions from time to time about translations and versions of the Bible and so on. And that, again, also could be an entire episode is just talking translations. So if you're thinking about the Bible and you're thinking about different translations, they really boil down to three main categories. And I would say two with a note on the third one, which I'll get to here in a second. So the first type of a translation is a word for word. That's where we're trying to take this word in Hebrew, this phrase in Hebrew, or Greek, or however it was originally written, and then translate that into English. We're trying to do a close to word for word translation. Then the next one is called thought for thought. This is where the translators sit down and they look at this passage, they look at this paragraph, this sentence, they look at this part of scripture. They say, what does this mean in the original Hebrew, in the original culture, in the original context? And how do we write that same thing in English or whatever the other language is that it's being translated into? So you have a word-for-word translation, and then you have a thought-for-thought translation. The third category is called paraphrase. I don't personally really actually consider this to be a translation because what it's doing is basically rewriting the text in modern vernacular common language of the person who's rewriting. So it's hopefully getting across the same points and the same theology, but it doesn't really fall into the category of translation from my view, from my perspective. It can be a very simple and easy way to read, but it's possible to miss a few things here or there. So I'm not opposed to a paraphrase. The most common one out there these days is called The Message, but it's not my preference. When I'm leading my events, we use the NLT, which is on a thought-for-thought basis. And even that some people could have a little bit of arguing with. But the reason I use that one is it's very readable. And during my live events, we're all reading the Bible, and so it needs to be readable. In my own personal study, I like to use the ESV, which is closer getting towards that word for word side versus the thought for thought. But those are the three main categories of Bibles. There's also something called an interlinear, which is the most accurate, if we use that word, in terms of this word equals this word, but it's not necessarily the most readable. Because if you do an actual translation of this word into this word, it might not make sense when you translate from one culture to another and from one language to another. So basic high level, how are the Bible translations, how are those broken down? Another question that I get is, what's one of the main challenges that men are facing today? There are so many possible answers for a question like this. The thing that comes to mind often for me, though, is that too many men feel like they are going through life alone. It's a main attack of the enemy. It's a main lie of the enemy that men are going to go through life alone. Nobody can understand what I'm dealing with. Nobody would be able to figure out my situation that I have right now. Only I am dealing with this marriage problem. Only I am dealing with this parenting problem. Only I have this struggle at work or this issue with my parents. I'm the only one who's dealing with questions of identity and purpose and mission and calling. All those things are lies. And men who believe those lies have a more difficult time going through life. We need other guys. We need other men who are on the same journey that we're on. Everybody's going to be at a different place. I've been married over 30 years, so I have a different perspective on marriage than somebody who's been married 1 year, but we're both trying to build marriages the way Christ told us to. We're both trying to parent the way that Christ told us to. This is one of the reasons that I started Significant Man Ministries and I started the fellowship group that I lead, because I needed those guys around me. I didn't have those guys around me. I know what it's like to go through those dark, difficult places of life when you don't have those like-minded other Christian men to walk the walk with you. That was one of the reasons I even began this work in the first place, was because I needed those guys in my life. So that is most definitely a main challenge for men. Going alone, thinking they're okay alone, thinking they have to do it all by themselves when they really don't. What is something from Christianity that I struggle with? This is a great question. Something that I struggle with is the violence and the wars, plural, of the Old Testament. And I don't have a great answer to this. This is just me sharing something that I struggle with. I understand the arguments. I understand the arguments that have been created about we can't have this nation come back and persecute and attack and fight against Israel in the future. Like, I understand the arguments that have been made, but I'm not personally at peace with those things. So that is something that I struggle with. If you're looking for an answer from me on this one, I don't have one for you. That is definitely an issue that I struggle with. The amount of violence, the amount of bloodshed, the amount of war in the Old Testament is definitely something I do struggle with. All right, and then the flip side question, what is something from Christianity that I don't struggle with? Now, for me, the main one here is the old idea of, why would an all-powerful, all-good God let bad things happen to good people? Now, many theologians and scholars, pastors have given their answers to this over the years. I've actually written up my answer to this in a short little book called Today, Daddy, because people would ask me this question pretty often. I don't struggle with this anymore. And yes, part of the answer is free will, but to me, that's not sufficient. That's not enough of an answer, because I would be challenged if somebody said free will is the reason that a 2-year-old dies of cancer. Free will is the reason that, a 1-year-old is killed in a tornado, things like that. So for me, without going deep into that here, just as a high level, I don't struggle with that. I don't find that a difficult question to deal with anymore. So what are some of my favorite Old Testament and New Testament books? Now, this is a great question. I love it. First of all, the whole Bible's inspired. So beginning to end is great. is worth reading. I did mention that I struggle sometimes with some of the violence and some of the wars that are in the especially the earlier part of the Old Testament, as Israel was moving into the Promised Land and all the various conquests and battles that took place there. Sometimes I struggle with that, but the whole Bible is inspired. I like all of it. In the Old Testament, I'm really drawn towards the wisdom books, specifically Ecclesiastes. That's probably my favorite Old Testament book, is Ecclesiastes. A lot of people think of that book as a negative. I think of it as quite positive. It's a book that I take a lot of the wisdom out of and try to learn from that book a lot. So I would say Ecclesiastes for the Old Testament. In the New Testament, all of the Gospels, anytime that we get to learn and listen to, read what Jesus had to say, that's always going to be top of the list. Second after that, in the New Testament is Ephesians. Ephesians has such great instruction and teaching. And then I really love the book of James. I love his blunt, direct, just get right to the point. I like that a lot. So those are some of the Old Testament and some of the New Testament books that I really enjoy. Let's see. All right, totally different. Who am I going to vote for? All right. Well, first of all, I'm pretty open with my political stuff. I am a political guy. I don't do a lot of political things on the podcast. If they are relevant to a topic, I will, but I don't mind sharing my own views. So I don't belong to any political party. I would consider myself a lowercase L libertarian. That's probably the political party that I would pick. But I'm not a political guy in terms of like, this is my party. With this upcoming election looking like it's going to be between Trump and Biden, I don't like either one of those guys. So yeah, neither one of them fit my mold. But what I suggest to everybody is to look through the issues, look at the particular candidates, look at what policies they have offered, look at what policies they support. I'm not quite so big on voting for somebody based on their personality. I'm more about the policies that they're after. So look at the one whose policies and policy proposals you feel most aligned with your worldview, which hopefully is a biblical worldview, and then vote accordingly. I'm not going to tell you how to vote. The thing that is really important to remember, though, is that no matter who sits behind the Resolute desk, Jesus is king. No matter which political party is in charge of the White House or Senate or the House, Jesus is the king. And yeah, we might have some difficult times in our culture based on political decisions, and I think we are currently experiencing some of those difficult times in our culture based on some political decisions. At the end of the day, Jesus is king, and we need to keep our eyes on him, on what he said and what he taught. I got one more here. How do I deal with haters online? Well, this has changed for me over the years. When I was first doing online stuff, first doing social media stuff, I was more of just traditional business things, entrepreneurial things, just sharing positive, uplifting messages. I didn't really say anything that anyone would consider controversial, so I didn't have any haters. When I switched and started to become much more open with my faith, when I started to make Christianity the foundation of what I was speaking and teaching, because that's how I lived my life offline, it didn't make sense to have a different online persona, if you will. When I started to be more open there with my Christianity, that's when I started to get some of the haters. That's when they started to show up. And sometimes they bother me. I'm a regular guy like everybody else, and sometimes they do bother me. When I just brought out my most recent book, The Tactical Guide to the Bible, and started to do some promotion for that, I got probably more hate than positive comments. And I have to admit that those first few days, that was hard. Even if you know what it is, even if you know you shouldn't take this stuff personally, even when you know that, I would log on to Facebook and I would be going to look and say, hey, how, are people enjoying this Bible book? Are they learning from it? Is it helping them understand the Bible? But instead I would log on and I would see a message that's literally F you, go die. That hurts. It does hurt when you see those kind of messages. So being outspoken, talking, someone who talks about Christianity, talks about the Bible, talks about Jesus. Yeah, I do deal with those negative comments. The difference is I don't let them get to me as much. So in the past, I would get a comment and it would hurt. I would have to spend some time saying, okay, how do I respond to this person? What would make them see what I'm saying? How would they be able to understand what I'm saying? And that kind of thing. These days, I don't reply to any of them. I delete all of them. If somebody asks a legitimate question, if they just have a disagreement and they have a question, I encourage that. I want somebody to ask a question. I want them to say, hey, what about this? Or what about this? That's cool. But if somebody's just going to be straight up hating, if they're going to put those hateful comments and those evil and vile comments, I just delete them. I don't even respond to them anymore. So the way that I deal with them is by deleting those comments. They roll away. Initially, if there's a whole bunch of them, I admit they hurt, but start to delete them, start to get rid of them, start to move on with my day, keep my eyes focused on God, keep my eyes focused on Jesus and what he wants. Ultimately, that's more important than any online comment, whether it's positive or negative. So yeah, that was the last one I had for this. I could do this for hours, but I don't know if it's super interesting or not. So if you're somebody who's regularly listening to the podcast, or if you watch this on YouTube, you can leave a comment and tell me if you enjoy this kind of thing, just bouncing around a bunch of different questions, a bunch of different topics and sharing some thoughts on them. If you're a Christian man and you're seeking a place to have real conversations like this, you need other Christian men to do that with. So if that's a local church group, if that's a Bible study that you have in your community, that's awesome. If you're looking for something with wider perspectives, voices from all over the country, or you don't have that, go over to significantman.com and check out the fellowship. As I mentioned earlier in this episode, it's specifically for guys who are seeking other men to do life with, to learn how do we get better as husbands, dads, fathers, leaders, just how do we get better in this life and do all of that with a Christian foundation. So if you're looking for something like that, head over to significantman.com and check out the fellowship group. And wherever you listen to this show, go ahead and subscribe to it, like it, rate it, review it, comment, share, all that stuff. It really helps other people find the show. It helps with the algorithm. So I appreciate you doing that. Thank you for that. All right. Enjoy the next show.